Okay, everybody, thanks so much for your interest in the program tonight. It's wonderful to see everyone, even if we can't get together in person. This topic, the aftermath of battle, has become more and more a popular one for historians and researchers. When I first started going to the battlefields years ago and becoming involved with the Civil War community, the aftermath of battle, the aspects of Civil War medical, the effects of the battle on civilians and children, and even these were not topics that were really delved into. For me, these have become the most interesting and challenging themes of a very terrible Civil War. Years ago, the history we used was top down. It was from the perspective of leaders and generals, their strategies, their decisions, their tactics. And this program is about people like us, history from the bottom up. During the program, we're also going to take a tour of the battlefield. And I like to say, for those of you who have really strong backgrounds in the Civil War and Gettysburg, and I know there are some real experts on tonight, this evening, please bear with some of my account, which will try to distill some of the topics and summarize the battle down to a manageable narrative. I'm talking with my hands, so I got to stop that because it's kind of distracting even for me. In summarizing some of the events and issues, I may skim or not elaborate in detail, and I especially want to beg your indulgence when I quote numbers. As you all know, numbers can be quite a slippery slope. How many men died outright? 6,000, 7,000, 8,000? This number keeps getting revised upwards, perhaps as many as 10,000. We'll never really know. How many horses and mules were killed and left their bodies on the field? Usually the numbers quoted are between 3,000 and 5,000. Chuck Teague says 5 to 7,000. I may use some of those numbers, but you see the huge disparity in them. In an attempt to pin down some of these numbers, many of the estimates are based on current and ongoing scholarship, and they're constantly being revised. As always, when we end, I hope I have done justice to the topic. I hope you have comments and questions. I hope we have time to meet and greet and comment after the program. And thanks again for your interest tonight. And I just want to say thanks to the roundtable, to Bob, Phil, Dave. Jen's not here tonight, but her too, who do all the work behind the scenes so we can have these programs. So the slide you see before you is the 116th Pennsylvania Monument. You know, we all know the three-day Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863 was the largest ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The battlefield today is marked with over 1,300 monuments, markers, and plaques. The monument you see here, the monument to the 116th Pennsylvania Regiment, part of the Irish Brigade, poignantly depicts the death of a young infantryman in battle. The soldier lies peacefully amid the rocks and fences of the Gettysburg landscape. The monument is haunting, it's touching. It does nothing to depict the terror and the suffering of so many men in the desperate struggle that was Gettysburg. The three-day Battle of Gettysburg was the greatest, most costly battle of a bloody Civil War. And this program will explore the sacrifices and fate of men who gave the last full measure of their devotion. So, you know, every time I drive the route around Gettysburg, and we're going to do it tomorrow, I remember to think about the plight of the Civil War infantrymen who trudged the same route, putting one tired foot in front of the other in terribly hot weather in the month of June, 1863. They wore ill-fitting Army shoes. They carried heavy loads. The men of the 17th Connecticut, many of whom I'm going to quote in this program, would leave accounts that many of them walked right out of their shoes. And they would be shoeless through the battle. and shoeless when they left Gettysburg in pursuit of Robert E. Lee. During the Gettysburg campaign, soldiers experienced some of the greatest forced marching of the war. The men marched in late June through hot, miserable, alternately dry and then humid and rainy weather with little food, little rest, and very little water. Both armies had orders to concentrate their forces and were using the road systems in Maryland and Pennsylvania to do so. Many men were disabled before they reached the battlefield from sunstroke, dehydration, and hunger. And upon reaching the battlefield, many regiments would go from marching column into the battle line and immediate combat. Many of these regiments fought the battle thirsty, hungry, sick, and shoeless. And not just the Southern boys, but the Union boys too. So on June 19th, Major General Joseph Hook, on June 19th, Joe Hooker, who was general of the Army of the Potomac and would be replaced by General Meade on June 28th, 3 days before the battle, ordered a reduction in the number of medical supply wagons in order to move the army faster through Virginia. The number of wagons assigned went from 6 wagons per division to 2. Dr. Letterman, who would become known as the father of battlefield medicine, tried to salvage the situation by creating a reserve supply train in Washington. When he realized battle was imminent, Letterman telegraphed to have the wagons brought up to Westminster, Maryland, 20 miles from Gettysburg. They arrived on the eve of the battle, but this horrendous situation was made worse when Meade ordered his corps commanders to send all wagons except ammunition and ambulances to the rear. When the battle began, there were very few medical supplies within 20 miles of where they would be desperately needed. And this created a horrific situation for casualties and the medical personnel expected to treat them. So even today, all roads lead to Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania. And here's the situation. Somewhere in Pennsylvania on July 28th, the Army of Northern Virginia, under the command of Robert E. Lee, spread over a 55-mile area in south central Pennsylvania. Knowing the Union Army is near, but not where exactly, Lee needed a place to concentrate his army. On June 28th, he located a small dot on his map where 12 roads led to the small town of Gettysburg from all directions. 2.5 days before the battle, the Confederate Army is issued marching orders to the Gettysburg area to concentrate the army. Somewhere in Maryland, the very next day, on June 29th, George Gordon Meade, the new Union commander of the Army of the Potomac, knew his army is spread over a 42-mile area in northern Maryland. He also knows Lee and his army of Northern Virginia is somewhere ahead of him to the north. He needed to bring his 95,000-man army bring them together, and he chooses Gettysburg. And like we said, still today, all roads in southern Pennsylvania lead to Gettysburg. So the first Union troops in Gettysburg are 2,800 Union cavalrymen under General John Buford. They know the rebels are somewhere west and north, and Buford has to control or picket all 5 of the roads north and west of town. He knows he's going to have to meet the enemy with a small group of cavalry the next day. He tells a subordinate on June 30th that tomorrow there will be hell to pay. They'll come at us 3 deep and they'll keep coming. And because of the road system and by necessity, both Lee and Meade chose Gettysburg as a place to concentrate their armies. Again, neither general knew exactly where the other was. Neither general chose to fight a battle here. And ironically, the armies are going to collide in what is often termed a meeting engagement that is going to become the greatest battle of the Civil War on the morning of July 1st. So some of you are going to recognize this view of Gettysburg from Benner's Hill. Gettysburg was and is a very small progressive town with it had nearly 2,400 souls as the war started. And the census in 1860 counted Gettysburg as a city. Houses were brick built, mostly with spacious fenced yards behind each. The houses had vegetable gardens, chickens, perhaps a cow, a shed, and the privy. The town took pride in its college, its Lutheran seminary, and all the benefits educational institutions bestowed. It had 3 weekly newspapers, and politics provided one of the most important and at times all-absorbing cultural activities. Religion provided the other. Politics and religion, two things we don't like to talk about with friends and family. The town had 3 weekly newspapers, as we said. It had 8 churches with 9 congregations, Lutherans and Presbyterians dominating. It had a new rural burial ground on Cemetery Hill. Schools were public. At the time, Pennsylvania required public education. And as one would expect of a college town, Gettysburg had good schools, including 2 private ones for girls and many private instructors who, tutored on the side. The town had gas light and some paved sidewalks. Its streets were alternately dusty and muddy, however. The seat of government for Adams County had a beautiful new courthouse built in 1859, close to the center square, or the Diamond, as the locals called it. It had new warehouses around a railroad station, also newly built in 1859, right after the railroad arrived in town. So Gettysburg's on the move. Doctors, lawyers, merchants, bankers, blacksmiths, and various craftsmen serving the surrounding countryside of small farmers. Carriage manufacturing is a large industry. They cater to the carriage trade. The ethnic stock was Scotch-Irish and German, but everyone else also seemed to be represented, including new immigrants who made up 7% of the population. Black people, mostly the poorest part of the community, came to 190 people, about 8% of the town's population. Yet, among the Black population, there were professionals and craftsmen. 1/3 of the Black population of Gettysburg had escaped from the slave states, and freedom meant everything. Gettysburg was a modern town, a place of hope for many, but soon the battle came, and for a time, making coffins would become an important occupation in this town. So would ferrying bereaved visitors to hospitals or the battlefield and digging up the dead. These would all be the new professions in Gettysburg. The town would be transformed into a blighted land and would need to recover body and soul. Gettysburg on July 4th, here's the situation. Stench fills the air. Excrement from perhaps 180,000 men and more than 90,000 horses is left behind. Rotting flesh, urine, flies, thousands of flies, millions of flies. If you remember all the descriptions, they're black. They cover everything. Dead men barely covered in shallow graves. At least 7,000 dead men, more likely 10. How many dead horses and mules? 3,000, 5,000, none buried. A nurse writes of carcasses steaming in the sun. The smell of putrid animal flesh mingles with the odor of human decay. War had come and war had gone and left only horror behind. So this 3 days of fury result when the armies meet here, and when they meet in this meeting engagement, so to speak, there's an incredibly swift escalation. Within a 36-hour period, 180,000 men 90,000 horses, 5,700 wagons, and over 600 pieces of artillery would descend on this small Pennsylvania town. The citizens would immediately become civilians in harm's way, trapped in the greatest battle of the Civil War. All of these men needed water. You know, when the army came to town, all the wells run dry. Food, needed facilities to relieve themselves, of which we know there were none. The horses alone will consume over 4 million pounds of grass and hay, 3 million pounds of grain, 3 million gallons of water, and leave 4 million pounds of manure. In addition, it is estimated that almost 5,000 of them, again, will die in the battlefield, leaving their carcasses. The first day's battle begins as that meeting engagement we talked about, as both armies smash together and as they try to concentrate in and around the town. The second day would become the bloodiest day of Civil War after the Battle of Antietam. The third day, the Great Cannonade preceding the Great Charge. And when the cannonade ceases, 12,500 Confederate soldiers emerge from Seminary Ridge in parade dress. It's immortalized in history as Pickett's Charge, but this charge would leave more than 5,000 Confederate casualties on these fields in less than an hour and end all hopes for Southern independence. Some sources report that the burial parties would find a woman dead in a Confederate uniform in front of the angle. On July 4th, Lee would begin to abandon the battlefield and retreat back to the Potomac River as residents of Gettysburg emerged from their cellars or returned to their homes. The small town of 2,400 was confronted with unimaginable wreckage, properties devastated, along with human beings destroyed on a massive scale. Both armies had over 51,000 casualties. The bodies of more than 7,000 dead men littered the streets, farms, and fields. Union wounded over 14,000 and Confederate over 18,000. Half of the Confederates were left behind when Lee retreated. Many of the wounded were dying, and others would take months of care to recover. Here's a little factoid that's always fascinated me. Estimates are about 7 million rounds of ammunition were fired during the battle. This does not include artillery. The weight of 7 million bullets would be about 500,000 pounds or 250 tons. The desperate townspeople after the battle would gather and sell the lead because prices for lead would hit 13 cents a pound. And in a town that is totally and economically devastated, gathering lead becomes a big business, especially for kids scavenging the battlefield. And that, as some of you can imagine and know, is going to create some horrific accidents. So we have homes, churches, public buildings, farms, fields, all become hospitals for the wounded. Typical of many of the buildings in town, the German Reformed Church on the corner of Stratton and High was newly refurbished at the time of the battle. On July 1st, following the Confederate occupation of Gettysburg, Dr. Abraham Stout, assistant surgeon of the 153rd Pennsylvania, opened the church for a hospital at the urging of one of his Confederate captors. Dr. Stout recalled that within a half hour, it was filled with wounded, mostly Union men from the 11th Corps collapse on Barlow's Knoll. For several days, surgeons worked at operating tables in the lecture room. Citizen volunteer nurses recalled newly painted walls splattered and pews soaked with blood. And they had to bore holes in the floor to let the blood and the effluvia run away. Eventually, many of the wounded were transferred to the school next door. Both buildings are still there. The church has significantly been changed. Eventually, many of the wounded are transferred to the school. Jenny Wade, the only civilian killed during the battle, was exhumed from the garden of her sister's home and buried in this church cemetery before being reinterred in the Evergreen Cemetery in November 1863. This cemetery is no longer there. It's almost a forgotten cemetery, but this theme of multiple burials would become a very common one after the Battle of Gettysburg. So many of the old houses of Gettysburg have been preserved. About 200 of the 400 original structures from the time of the battle remain. With 51,000 casualties, many, if not most of the buildings were used as hospitals, operating rooms, recovery rooms, and even as burial sites in earthen floored cellars. Again, Jenny Wade's first burial was in the garden of her sister's home. Blood-stained floorboards remain part of many of these structures that remain from the battle. I will tell you the cellar burials, 2 cellar burials, are very evident, and they are marked on Stratton Street if you know where to look. So there's still vestiges of the cellar burials that took place in dirt cellars around town. So, when the firing dies down, this is East Cemetery Hill. Our 17th Connecticut was in position here. And when the firing dies down after the evening of the 2nd, the guys wanted to go out and see their dead. They wanted to recover their wounded friends. Many were curious about the battlefield they had fought upon, and many felt relief that they had survived the horror and fate of many of the mutilated dead. On the morning of July 3rd, after an evening of intense fighting, Lieutenant Peck, Company D, 17th Connecticut, would describe the dead in front of his position on Cemetery Hill. I remember seeing a rebel color bearer laying dead near our batteries that morning. I also saw a large dead Reb who had a straw hat on. His sleeves were rolled up. He had no coat on. He wore a U.S. belt with a U.S. plate turned down. I picked up a couple of stars that had torn from a rebel flag and a piece of flag also. So Lieutenant Peck goes out to look at the battlefield after the fight that night before on the 2nd. I do want to say something about this photograph. Again, it's a view of East Cemetery Hill, and Bill Frazanito will call this is the left plate of a 2-plate picture, and Bill Frazanito will call this plate one of the finest documentary scenes taken at Gettysburg. It's taken from the Union line. You can see right into town. If you stand in this area today, this is some of the most churned up ground in town or the battlefield. The school is there now. It's really, there's no similarity to what it was when you look at this photograph. I want to point out that, again, this is the left side of a double plate photo. And if you look at the right side, I don't know if my cursor won't move. If you look at the right side, you can see a church. And if you look just to the left of the church behind the tree, you can see the school on High Street. That's the Dutch Reformed Church. And this shows us how these guys fighting on the field could look right into town. The open view sheds are just not available to us in the present day, so it's very difficult to see what they saw. But these guys could see right through to town. On July 4th, the morning, a doctor's going to step out of that, going to stand out where the guys can see him, 17th Connecticut guys can see him, and he's going to wave his hat, trying to signal them that the Confederates were abandoning the town. If this ground looks familiar to you, this is also in this area, Mary Tepe, the vivandière of the 104th Pennsylvania. She would see combat, and she would also nurse the wounded after the battle. There's a famous picture of her taken leaning against a fence post in this area. I don't know if Cindy McShane is on tonight, but she portrays Mary Tepe uh, as part of the Confederation of Union Generals. Some good videos on YouTube that she's made on location. So if you're interested in some women in the Civil War, please look those up. And more Civil War women are available for you to contact tonight. Our COOG, or Confederation of Union Generals, Major Pauline Cushman is with us tonight, and I'm sure if you are on Facebook, you're into Gettysburg, you know who the Major is. So, some really good living history there. So I just wanted to show you this picture from the Coster Avenue mural by Mark Dunkelman. If you look at this very prominent figure in the foreground and you look at his belt buckle, you see this Confederate with a U.S. belt buckle upside down, as Lieutenant Peck described the dead Confederate on the battlefield on July 3rd. Now, what happens to the dead? Okay, the dead are everywhere. What happens to the dead? Well, Union dead are buried first. Confederate dead would linger grotesquely on the fields and farms and were hastily interred in mass graves and shallow burial pits. These were inadequate to keep the dead covered during the heavy rains beginning on July 4th that would wash the covering off the dead and leave them fearsomely and grotesquely exposed to the elements, exposed to the rooting hogs and dogs. The birds of prey had all been scared away from the field by the artillery. This is on Culp's Hill behind the 2nd Maryland. Really, it's the 1st Maryland. They were the 1st Maryland during the battle. The depressions of the mass burial trenches can still be seen. The depressions are often marked with small Confederate flags to honor the soldiers that were once interred there. The monument to the 2nd Maryland Infantry was the very first Confederate monument erected on the battlefield, and it created a lot of controversy. So I know in this day and age, we can all, understand monuments and controversy. So there were Union Maryland troops here that fought the battle, and the Confederate Maryland troops were also here. This is the Confederate monument to Maryland troops, and there was, again, a lot of controversy. And if you look at the regiment carved into the granite here, it says 2nd Maryland Infantry CSA, because 1st Maryland, that designation was reserved for the Union Marylanders. So, Gettysburg, we're going to talk about photographing the dead at Gettysburg. Gettysburg's human toll is more visually documented than any other Civil War battlefield. 37 post-battle photographs show roughly 100 corpses. That's about 1% of the dead at Gettysburg. Of these, we can photographically pinpoint some 80 different bodies, all of which are near Devil's Den or on the Rose Farm. Alexander Gardner labeled the picture in the lower right, The Horrible Effects of Canister. A soldier most likely represents one of the many, many dead that were ravaged by wild pigs and scavengers on the battlefield, who attacked and ate the bodies of the dead and the wounded. Now, we all know there's no official identification tags or dog tags. The pockets of the dead were gone through, and if they could be identified, their names were written on any kind of board or wood available, and then the dead were covered up as quickly as possible. There are 2 known photos showing 9 Confederate soldiers in unfinished graves with headboards on the Rose Farm. Some are identifiable, including the man at the right, whose headboard Tim Smith, historian Tim Smith, deciphered under magnification. That's the inset at the right. As W.C. Butler, 3rd South Carolina. He is Private William Calvin Butler, who now rests in Head Springs Cemetery, South Carolina. Now, the Rose Farm is undoubtedly the bloodiest farm in American history. The dead were lined up in rows awaiting shallow trench burials, and the dead on the Rose Farm were some of the last on the field to be buried and hence photographed. The photo insert was probably taken July 6, 1863, and the photographic recreation you see in the larger color photo was from 2009, done with Sue Boardman and wet plate photographer Todd Harrington, and the 1863 photos of the dead at Rose Farm were used to recreate the scenes. Now, because of photographic analyst Bill Frazanito's work, we know, you're looking, of course, at Gardner's famous glass plate photograph of what he would call the sharpshooter. So we know because of Frazanito's work, the body was moved by the photographers by dragging the corpse on a blanket and propping his head on a knapsack. His gun, not the type used by sharpshooters, against the stone wall, was propped up in the background to compose a more dramatic picture. It is a very dramatic picture. It's one of the most recognizable photographs of the Civil War. But what do we know about this? Well, let's look at this boy in this photo. Scott Fink of the Georgia State Archives has really taken a good look at this photo. And he proposes that, knowing the area where the 2nd Georgia rallied, he's did some photographic comparisons between the dead sharpshooter and the soldier mentioned as being one of the Georgia boys. Among the dead was John R. Ashe from 2nd Georgia Company A. By comparing a photo of John Ashe from another most likely 10 years earlier, the similarities are striking. They share the same nose, mouth, eye, brows, chin, hairline, and ears. Regardless, Scott says, if I am correct or not, please remember this soldier had a family who lost him in this terrible, costly battle. And in the end, isn't that why we study these photos again and again? The young soldier whose family was saddened by the news of his death on a faraway battlefield, where his regiment and name were lost in the chaos of battle. Ultimately, we may be getting closer to knowing more about this young Georgian than ever before, not only his regiment, but his name as well. And I will interject that the greatest tragedy of the Civil War is that over half of all the dead remain unknown. The Army had no formal mechanism for notifying families when a soldier died, and soldiers had no formal official method of identification on their persons. Record keeping in the chaos of battle, impossible. And it's Clara Barton who just takes this so seriously. She has so much empathy for the families of the unknown dead, the loss of so many men, that she is the one who starts the missing soldiers office. She'll ultimately, with a lot of help, identify 22,000 unknown men, which is a drop in the bucket. But 22,000 families had closure for their loved ones. So again, we'll never know the precise number of unknown dead at Gettysburg. We'll never know. But this is a popular depiction of the man who becomes known as the unknown soldier of Gettysburg, representing all of the unknown fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers who were loved and lost at Gettysburg. The soldier's body was found near the center of Gettysburg. No identification, no regimental numbers on his cap, no corps badge on his jacket, no letters, no diary, nothing except the ambrotype, the photograph of three small children clutched in his hand. The picture of his three beloved children was the last thing he saw as he died. Dr. Bourne of Philadelphia had the picture reprinted in hopes of identifying the soldier and the children. Many stories and the photo were reproduced in woodcuts that caught the nation's imagination and title under the caption, "Whose father was he?" Well, we know the story. Stories published all over the North. Family portraiture had become commonplace before and during the Civil War. And the family of the fallen soldier, whose picture was all over, described in newspapers, a woodcut was put in newspapers, was asked to identify him. Today, we're able to seamlessly integrate words and pictures, captions and photographs. But the Humiston story really allows us to see how this was done before there was the technology to reproduce photographs in newspapers or broadsheet. So they had to make a woodcut and then replicate it that way. Well, months after the battle, a woman in Portville, New York, was shown this story about the photograph that appeared in a publication called the American Presbyterian. Well, this woman fears the worst, having not heard from her husband since the Battle of Gettysburg. She asked the town postmaster to write this Dr. Bourne's on her behalf and request a copy of this photograph. When she opens the letter from Philadelphia in late November 1863, Philinda Humiston knew her husband, Amos Humiston, the father of her three children, Franklin, Alice, and Frederick, was dead. Well, this man now lies in the New York section of the National Cemetery. The bronze plaque marker on Stratton Street that many of us are very familiar with, where his body was found, is affixed to a granite boulder depicting him and his children. The monument was dedicated in 1993. It is the only monument to an individual enlisted man on the Gettysburg field. So, dead men and strong women, because you had to be strong to survive. And Elizabeth Thorne, pictured here, had come to America with her husband Peter and her parents. The time of the battle, Peter was away with his regiment, and Elizabeth, 6 months pregnant, had to care for her parents and three little boys. They were the caretakers of Evergreen Cemetery. When the army came in, she baked bread for the troops, kept tin cups available at her well. When the fighting got closer, she and her family went into the cellar. She wound up acting as a guide for an officer during the battle, walking on the safe side of his horse as bullets whizzed and shells exploded. It might and probably was General Howard, whose horse she walked alongside. The family subsequently retreated to a house down the Baltimore Pike, the Muzzer House, but during the battle, she and her father returned to the house to check on the hogs, which, of course, were all gone. One of the most recent monuments, the monument at the right at Gettysburg, pictures her here. Elizabeth Thorne, pregnant, with the shovel she used to dig 105 graves after she returned to her home. So this is the area where she dug some of those graves. And I'm going to talk about the 17th Connecticut and their position on Cemetery Hill here. The 17th Connecticut would remain on, oh, wait a minute, something's not right. Hold on there, everybody. Sorry about that. Here we go. Above are some of the graves that were dug by Elizabeth Thorne and her father. Now, remember, she's 6 months pregnant. She had put on a heavier dress to leave the house, put a dress on over her other dress, much heavier. She would wear that dress for 6 weeks after the battle. Again, 6 months pregnant. It was a horrific situation, and she would dig these graves. The town would ultimately purchase property adjacent to Evergreen Cemetery to bury all of the soldiers' property. But unfortunately, all through the summer, the town had to wait. They could not disinter these bodies in the heat. And all summer, the townspeople endured a horrific stench that could be smelled for miles around. The horses, all the 5,000 horses, were burned, and this caused even more distress and smells. After the first frost in October, the town did begin to disinter the dead and place them in the National Cemetery. Bodies would be buried by states, as you all know, and once they got closer to the dedication, David Wills, the lawyer who put everything together from the town, would invite all of the important people to attend a dedication ceremony on November 19th. Now, this young man is a 17th Connecticut guy. His name is Alva Wilcox. His stone is on the hill of Evergreen Cemetery where Elizabeth Thorne buried all of the bodies. He was one of the bodies that she buried. His body, however, is not under that government stone. It's a long story, but after the battle, so many people flocked to Gettysburg. They wanted to take their loved ones home. And this is a whole gruesome story. After the battle, Alva's brother, C.K. Wilcox, and his sister-in-law, Alonzo Scranton's wife, Alonzo Scranton, they were brothers-in-law in the 17th Connecticut. He had been wounded. Brother-in-law and sister-in-law came down. They couldn't locate wounded Alonzo, but they searched in vain for brother Alva. So they found him. He had been buried by Elizabeth Thorne, but they could not find a coffin to bring him home in. So they got this bright idea to board the train from Gettysburg to Baltimore, and they got there, and they did actually find a coffin. But on the train from Gettysburg to Baltimore, there were two bodies that were so decayed that they were running out of the coffins, and the train kept stopping to bury other bodies because the smell was so bad no one can breathe. Ultimately, the bodies on trains were banned without following some very strict guidelines based on these stories and these events. So Mrs. Scranton and Mr. Wilcox did find that coffin. They came back to Gettysburg, but once they got back there, the authorities forbade removing any more bodies until the first frost. So what they did was they went to the cemetery. They had Alva dug up. They put him in the coffin that they had procured, and they reburied him in the cemetery. And then that winter, Mr. Wilcox returned to Gettysburg again, had Alva dug up again, and took him home to Madison, Connecticut for his third and last burial. And again, this theme of multiple burials is going to recur again and again. I want to read you this brief account that was about this episode. As the train neared Gettysburg, on which Mr. Wilcox and Mrs. Scranton were on, the stench from the battlefield was so very bad that the doctors who were on the train gave the ladies some medicine and put camphor on their handkerchiefs to be held to the nose. Chloride of lime was scattered throughout the town where they stopped, which was at a private house. The name of the family was Adams, and I believe there was an Adams family on Baltimore Street. The folks there told them that the blood ran in their own dooryard while men lay on their doorsteps and around the yards. Some of the men were so drawn up and cracked open before they were buried. After Mr. Wilcox reached home, he was taken with fever, and Mrs. Scranton did not get over the effects of it through the whole summer. This is another thing about the casualties at Gettysburg. We don't know how many children and babies and elderly passed after the battle due to things like typhoid and bad water and disease. And so that just brought up a body count that we will never ever know the extent of. And then there's the horses. Oh, those horses and those mules. This is obviously the Trossel barn today. This is where most of the wounded and dying from the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and the Round Tops are carried during the battle. General Sickles used this farm as his headquarters. He would lose his leg when a 12-pound cannonball clipped him as he directed the battle on horseback. He had his leg shipped to the new Army Medical Museum, which was collecting samples for display. And it was in they say, its own little coffin. It was probably in a box. He tossed one of his cards in it that said compliments of General D.E. Sickles. And he would visit his leg every July 2nd on the anniversary of his losing it after the battle. So that's another story for another day. But the house and barn standing there today are original structures. The Trossel house was used as a hospital at the time of the battle. It had 7 rooms and a basement. The barn still bears the scars of battle, that hole near the roof line through which a cannonball passed on July 2nd. We can go see that today. Following the battle, the Trossel house is wrecked. I mean, this is just an example of what people are coming back to on their farms and their homes. Dead, dying, and wounded men were laying in the yard. Dead horses were everywhere. And this is what Mrs. Trossel returns to. Dead horses and mules had to be disposed of. On some battlefields, special burial details were assigned to the task of burying horses. They would chop off the legs, drag or push the carcass into a burial hole, and cover it with soil. At Gettysburg, I just want to add the average horse weighs about 1,000 pounds, so this burial work is significantly difficult. At Gettysburg, so many dead animals littered the landscape, and so many fallen soldiers needed to be buried that the authorities decided to bury the dead soldiers and burn the animal corpses, hoping to dispose of the horses before disease could spread. They were not successful. The work was done by soldiers of the Provost Guard, citizens, and Confederate prisoners. And many civilians and soldiers remaining in the air remembered the horrible odor of the burning horse flesh, which smelled like an escape from a hateful charnel house. But not all of the horses on the field of Gettysburg when the fighting ended were cold and dead. What happened to those injured horses and mules? Well, those with no chance of survival were put down on the battlefield, put out of their misery with a merciful shot to the head. But there were many other horses that they tried to nurse back and recover, because the Army needed horses to carry on its business. But many of those horses and mules were labeled unrecoverable, several hundred. They were herded to a thicket near Rock Creek. It was likely on Spangler farm property. They were shot, and heaps of skeletons remained of them for decades. And it was a pretty shocking reminder of the horrific loss of equestrian life during the battlefield. But not all equestrian carcasses were burned or buried. Widow Lydia Leicester, whose home you see in this picture here had been taken over as General Meade's headquarters during the battle, testified that 17 dead horses stayed in her front yard. She waited 2 years for the flesh to rot away and sold the bones, which totaled about 750 pounds, for some money to try to, survive economically. If you look at this picture of her house, you see this big mound in front of the house. That is most probably covering a horse's body that was heaped by the fence. Military accounts of the battle record an artillery shell tearing through tied horses at Meade's headquarters during the barrage prior to the Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble charge. So there's plenty of evidence the widow returned to a pretty shocking sight and a nauseating stench she just didn't have the strength to deal with. Hence, leave them there, let them rot, sell the bones. Not a pretty picture. So hospitals and farms, fields, churches, houses, every public building is a hospital. At the close of the battle, you've got 22,000, 24,000 wounded soldiers of both armies requiring medical treatment. Temporary field hospitals were established wherever there was a source of water and shelter. Every building is used: churches, farm buildings, private homes, barns. And for some, the only shelter available is provided by trees or a piece of canvas strung between poles. Wounded are everywhere, including the number of Southern wounded left behind when the Confederates retreated. These men fell into Union hands and were treated with equal care by Union surgeons already overworked. Amputation is, of course, the most performed surgery during the Civil War, and not because surgeons were primitive sawbones, but because amputations saved lives. Even today, with the wounds from the IEDs in the Mideast, pressure cooker bombs of the Boston Marathon attack, amputation is the only viable treatment. Even modern medicine cannot save the pulverized limbs of the wounds of the 21st century that so resemble the wounds of the Civil War. So Spangler's one of the farms, and the most pertinent example. This Spangler 156-acre farm was taken as the 11th Corps Hospital on July 1st, 1863. The farm was used as a hospital. The buildings and the property were full of wounded: the barns, the haymows, the house, the outbuildings, the surrounding fields. The number of wounded at this hospital can only be estimated between 1,700 and 2,000. The fields of the farm also served as the Union Artillery Reserve. And on July 2nd, the fields toward the Union line and Cemetery Hill would be filled with over 110 cannon, countless limbers and caissons, nearly 1,500 horses, and 2,300 men. Now, Rock Creek was perfect. It provided water for the animals, which needed about 10 gallons each a day. The fields allowed the horses to graze. They needed 12 to 14 pounds a day. And horses also required grain, oats, barley, corn, and each animal would produce 10 to 15 pounds of manure and 2 gallons of urine per day. So this location allowed this artillery reserve to be dispatched quickly to wherever it was needed in the Union line. It was a terrific lifesaver for Union victory. The Spangler family did choose to remain on their farm, and the family of 6 would spend the next 5 weeks in one of the very small bedrooms on the second floor of this home until the wounded were cleared from the farm and sent to Camp Letterman. Now, Spangler Farm, this is a picture of the barn when the farm was purchased in 2008 by the Gettysburg Foundation. The barn has just been magnificently restored. Post-war additions to the barn were removed. It was stabilized. All the wood that could be saved was used in the restoration. And the threshing floor where the wounded lay on the second floor of this barn is almost all original. It's a jewel on the battlefield. On July 3rd, as the Confederates bombarded the northern battle line prior to Pickett's charge, the farm was dangerously shelled and by overshots flying above the Union line. On July 3rd, S.C. Romig of the 153rd Pennsylvania, who was wounded and laid on the threshing floor of the barn near the big door, he wrote, I had a fine view of the bursting shells coming in our direction. There were at one time 6 explosions of shells in 1 minute. The danger was becoming so great that every man was moved, excepting myself and an old German. The surgeon who had been in shortly before looking at my wound ran for his life. As he passed the door, he called, "Get out of there as soon as you can." Knowing that I could not move, he sent 2 men to carry me away. It's another picture of the front of the barn before its restoration. The operating tables were located under the overhang of the barn. General Carl Schurz, division commander for the 11th Corps, did come to this hospital on July 4th and wrote, I saw long rows of men lying under the eaves of the buildings, the water pouring down their bodies in streams. Most of the operating tables were placed in the open, partially protected against the rain. There stood the surgeons, their sleeves rolled up, their bare arms as well as their linen aprons smeared with blood. Around them, pools of blood and amputated arms or legs in heaps. A surgeon, having been long at work, put down his knife, exclaiming that his hand had grown unsteady and that this was too much for human endurance, hysterical tears streaming down his face. I would highly, highly recommend the book by Ron Kirkwood. It's a great book titled Too Much for Human Endurance about this property. It is just eye-opening and probably one of the best Gettysburg books to be published recently. This is a letter written on July 4th during that horrific rainstorm by 17th Connecticut Private Company D, J. Henry Blakeman. He writes to his mother. This is the first and last pages of the letter. Inset is a photograph of his best friend, Stephen Crawford. Henry Stephen, Selah Blakeman, Henry's cousin, and Sylvester Rounds of Company D stood shoulder to shoulder on the first day at Barlow's Knoll. And one volley is going to take 3 of them down and leave 1 standing. Henry and Sylvester are horribly wounded. Stephen Crawford, who was Henry's best friend since they were born, is shot in the head and instantly killed. And the first thing that Henry sees when after he becomes conscious again. I won't read this letter to you. It is one of the most poignant that I have ever read. It is a difficult letter to read, but I do want to point out the last lines of the letter. He writes to his mother, I was hit face toward them. No Reb saw my back. Henry. We just can't put into words sometimes what these men went through. Again, this is Spangler Farm. Many of the 17th Connecticut, many of the 11th Corps are going to be, those wounded men are going to be brought to this farm. Justice Silliman, 17th Connecticut, would write home that Rebel General Armistead, who was wounded and a prisoner, was taken to this hospital and has since died. Armistead would die in the summer kitchen. Justice Silliman goes on, he was rather past middle age. He lay in the kitchen on the night of July 3rd. There were at first 3,000 wounded in our hospital. Hundreds have limbs amputated. The barn more resembled a butcher shop than any other institution. One citizen, on going near it, fainted away. Also in the summer kitchen was Captain Frederick Stowe, son of Harriet Beecher Stowe. He had been brought to the 11th Corps Hospital. He had been struck in the head by a fragment of a shell which entered his right ear. Dr. Van Arnhem recalled that Fred Stowe was in one corner of the room of the summer kitchen and Armistead in the other. With Armistead's death and Stowe's removal by train away from Gettysburg in mid-July, the kitchen with its beehive oven would again be able to be devoted to cooking and baking bread for all the wounded that remained. This is a picture of the restored barn. Another 17th Connecticut man, W.W. Payne, would remember that on the morning of July 5th, I was detailed as one of a scouting party to go and search for stragglers belonging to the regiment. We were directed to take the road leading to the 11th Corps Hospital, some 2 miles to the rear, and scour the country on either side and bring with us any soldiers of our regiment who were found not having been detailed as an attendant at the hospital. We were to meet at the hospital, which was a large barn. I took the fields at the right, but did not find any soldiers of the 17th Regiment until we reached the hospital. There was a large orchard in the rear of the barn, and under nearly every tree was a shelter tent or rude shelter of boards constituting an improvised hospital and occupied by one or more wounded soldiers. So Peyton greets the wounded he knew, several who had amputations, several who would subsequently die of their wounds. He did encounter a couple of skulkers. They asked him for food. All were hungry. He passed out whatever hardtack he had. And on the way out to the road, passing the corner of the barn. Now, these guys are all hungry. They're all looking for food. At the edge of the road that leads, the farm lane that leads to the road, I noticed 2 large hogsheads that stood close to the roadside. Curiosity prompted me to look into them. I was horrified to find them filled with human limbs, arms, legs, hands, and feet that had been amputated from the bodies of the brave boys in blue, that their lives might possibly be saved. I turned away with a shudder. Such is war. This is George Nixon. He would also, he's 73rd Ohio. He would also be wounded and brought to the Spangler farm. He would, his descendant would be great-grandson Richard Nixon. And George Nixon is a very sad story. He was an indigent farmer. He was from Ohio. He enlisted age 40, probably for economic reasons. He needed a paycheck. He left 9 children behind, and he died and was buried at the Spangler farm, and was subsequently disinterred from the Spangler property and buried in the Ohio section of the National Cemetery. You know, July 9th, here's Henry again, and here is Dr. Robert Hubbard, the surgeon of the 17th Connecticut. They're at Spangler Farm, and Dr. Hubbard is going to write to his wife on July 9th. Wounded of the 11th Corps are fast being sent to Baltimore and other places. The wounded of the Corps will number, I think, 16 and 1700. Of these, I have already sent away 800 and will send more today. J. Henry Blakeman, that we talked about previously, he is very badly wounded. He's shot through the side, and he's one of the men who's transported to Baltimore. This hospital will be closed. Spangler Farm Hospital will be closed during the first week in August 1863, when all of the wounded would be transported to Camp Letterman, the general hospital. And if they could be transported out of Gettysburg, they were. Henry would write to his sister on July 17th, 1863, from Jarvis General Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Dear sister, last Monday we were brought here. Before we came here, we saw pretty hard times. Lying on the ground with only a shelter tent for 5 days. I was wet through and not half enough to eat. I wore the same shirt I was wounded in, all bloody, for 9 days, and half that time it was full of maggots, and wore the same pants till I got here. The Rebs flanked me, I guess. I shall be good for another dig at them yet. Henry. Well, he did recover. It took him 11 months in various Union hospitals, but he did return to his regiment. I want to say a word about the maggots that infested his shirt. It was these maggots, nature surgeons, that may have cleaned the dead and infected flesh from Henry's wound and saved his life. Again, he would spend 11 months in Union hospitals and ultimately return to his regiment. I just wanted, this is this faces toward what was the hospital graveyard of the Spangler Farm, and about 185 Union and 20 Confederate bodies were buried here, including General Amistad before he was disinterred by the family and taken to Baltimore. It was this temporary graveyard that many people came to looking for their loved ones. And all over the field of battle, family members would come in search of their dead to bring them home. And one of the searchers is looking for a young man from Connecticut. His name is Rufus Warren. His uncle would come from Connecticut to look for his nephew. Now, Rufus is going to be wounded the first day on Barlow's Knoll. His family would frantically scan the papers for news, but learned nothing. If you know anything about casualty lists, they're notoriously inaccurate. So they were looking in the papers, looking for news. It wasn't until a friend in town brings his brother's body home from Gettysburg. His brother was killed the first day. Rufus is wounded the first day. And his uncle sets out to find his nephew at Spangler Farm. With the rioting in New York, communication and travel is halted. And when the uncle left Connecticut, with the intention of seeing him alive, if possible, on July 17th, it was already too late for him to see his nephew. He did get to Gettysburg. He did obtain a pass from the provost marshal, and he came to Spangler Farm, and he writes, "We were conducted to his grave, which we found decently marked with a headboard, name, company, date of death, etc. This we secured and brought home with us. We returned to the village and made all the necessary preparations. And this is one of the few remaining burial markers, wood burial markers that they would use on the battlefield. They were crude boards. This is Lieutenant Manning Livingston's 3rd Artillery marker. They would the families, if they came and disinterred a family member or a man, and they would put him in a coffin, and they would nail the marker to the coffin. Very few of these survived. This marker in this picture is in the Peace Memorial Church on Baltimore. It's encased in a bronze plaque, and we can see it today. But again, one of the very few markers to survive. So anyway, let's get our story with Rufus Warren. There you see him on the right. He died on July 17th at the 11th Corps Hospital at Spangler's Farm. He was wounded on July 1st. His left leg was amputated. And when his uncle gets to the farm, he's lucky enough to meet George Dickens, another Connecticut man who is nursing the wounded, first at the Dutch Reformed Church and subsequently at Spangler Farm. So Uncle Hiram says, learning of the probable direction of the 11th Corps Hospital, we set out with some trepidation. With indescribable emotion, we approached the camp, and soon, with intense solicitude, we inquired about the fate of our poor nephew, and were met with the answer by George Dickinson, a member of his company, that he expired the morning of the 17th, about the time we left our home. We were conducted to his grave, which we found decently marked with a headboard, name, company, date of death, etc. We secured this and brought it home with us. We returned to the village, Gettysburg, and made all the necessary preparations. Went about and around the village and saw the destruction and ravages of war. We went again in the PM to the hospital and learned of the following facts of the case of our deceased. He was wounded by a cannonball in the leg, which had to be amputated above the knee, which was done on the 4th with much fortitude. Uncle Hiram continues, arose the next morning, the 20th, and went with a friend and took up the body, which cost $1. Had it conveyed to the office of Dr. Bunnell. You can see the undertaker there, Dr. Bunnell, probably at Camp Letterman, preparing a body with the embalming process. So we took up the body where it was disinfected and covered with charcoal and chloride of lime, then put into an airtight coffin with gutta percha edges, with long screws thickly set, then put into a large box and tan bark closely packed between. This being done, it was taken to the express office for transportation. The funeral was the following Sunday, the 26th. The service were held in the Methodist Episcopal Church in the PM. It was thronged within and without. So died our nephew, who was one of our family, at age 21 years, 7 months, and 18 days. Hiram O. Nash of Ridgefield. So, this situation is pretty untenable. Within 2 weeks of the battle, it becomes quite obvious that something has to be done to consolidate thousands of wounded left behind by two armies. Dr. Jonathan Letterman had left with the Army of the Potomac on July 6th. He had ordered 106 surgeons to remain behind with the wounded. There were 60 different hospitals around Gettysburg. Some sources say upwards of 100, probably if you counted all the houses and barns. That was probably pretty close. So there's there's like 24,000 wounded, all need attention. There are approximately 5,400 Confederates among those, and they were in 24 hospitals in camps around Gettysburg. Injured men who could be sent away to permanent military hospitals in cities along the coast were sent by train. The rest were moved to Camp Letterman. And those were the most severely injured men who could not be sent anywhere else and had to remain behind to recuperate or die. The hospital was positioned along the York Pike on high, mostly well-drained ground in a large grove. There was a lot of shade, fresh air. That was very important. The railroad was close, permitted litters to be walked to the cars. A good spring, there were 2 good springs on the property, along with several wells later dug, so there was plenty of clean water. And the hospital remained open until November 20th. One day after Lincoln's Gettysburg address. Now, you got a lot of dead. We get to this, what are we going to do with them? We want our dead buried honorably. And Governor of Pennsylvania comes to survey Gettysburg, and he's just appalled. And after his visit, there's a plan set in motion for the establishment of a soldiers' national cemetery. Governor Curtin's visit is going to appall him. Ruined farms, homes filled with injured men, fresh graves of the fallen in every conceivable place on the field. Many of the Union dead in unmarked graves. Only fresh sod thrown over the remains identified the site as a burial. Heavy rains had washed away the earth from many of the shallow graves. Grotesquely blackened hands, arms, and legs protruded from the earth like the devil's own planting, a harvest of death, while the stench of death hung heavy in the air. So something has to be done. And it's, in these words, a grisly but noble enterprise to honor the fallen. So removing the Union dead to a central burial place of honor begins. Now, each time a dead soldier was dug up on the shattered battlefield, the short bearded figure you see to the right is Samuel Weaver. He's there with his iron hook to ensure that it's not a rebel. He could usually tell by shoes, undergarments, or coat. Now, Confederates often wore confiscated Yankee trousers, but never the blue wool Union coat, according to Mr. Weaver. Rebel clothing was cotton and gray or brown in color. If the soldier, these are his words, if the soldier was from the South, he was left in place and his grave closed up again. In no instance was a body allowed to be removed which had any portion of the rebel clothing on it, Weaver reported. Samuel Weaver and his team were searching only for boys in blue, our fallen heroes, to be removed to Gettysburg's new national cemetery. There, no Confederate could rest. In the months and years after the Civil War, here in July 1863, Weaver and subsequently his son Rufus were part of a vast and grisly enterprise in which the bodies of thousands of soldiers, first Union and then Confederate, were exhumed and removed. The reinterment to the National Cemetery was carried out from October 1863 until spring 1864. This photo was taken February 1864 in a churchyard in Hanover, east of Gettysburg, where 19 Union soldiers were killed in a cavalry skirmish on the day before the battle. Many fallen soldiers went unidentified. Samuel Weaver, the man in charge of the disinterments and burials, estimated that 979 of the Union bodies he exhumed were nameless. It was a gruesome task. Weaver used the hook to probe into the clothing and pockets for items that might help with identification, but it was undertaken with a sense of Victorian care and obligation, and the Victorians were very familiar with death. Many of these burials were simply in trenches. In Gettysburg, Weaver found as many as 70 Union soldiers in one trench and 150 rebels in another. And again, the result is that many fallen soldiers went unidentified. Again, he reported that 979 of the bodies he exhumed were nameless. Now, you have to realize there are thousands of bodies in all stages of decomposition, from skeletal to well preserved, depending on where they had been buried. Men had been shot to death, struck by cannonballs, stabbed, clubbed, burned. There were bodies in cornfields, in orchards, under apple trees, along roadsides, in woods, and beside creeks. Some had been well buried by comrades. Most had been buried in hastily dug holes that were easily disturbed by animals, rain, or a plow. Weaver and his men, led by a free black subcontractor named Basil Biggs, dug up 3,354 Northern soldiers and moved them to the new cemetery from October 27th, 1863 to March 18th, 1864. And that's only the Union boys. So the Soldiers National Cemetery, established on Cemetery Hill, it's a central part of the battlefield now, designed by landscape architect William Saunders, who was hired to design the cemetery, and his plan was heralded for its simplicity and equality. The reinterments began in the fall of '63. Union dead were buried in semicircular rows in state plots in the cemetery, the final resting place for defenders of the Union cause. The burials were far from complete when the cemetery was dedicated on October 19, 1863, when the dedication ceremony took place. Edward Everett, the great Victorian orator, would speak for 2 hours to crowds that gathered under the cold November sunshine. President Abraham Lincoln would speak for only 2 minutes, and he would speak what many consider the greatest 10 sentences in American history, establishing forever that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So approximately 800 to 1,000 bodies are believed to remain unmarked on the battlefield, buried where they died. In March 1996, a tourist was walking the battlefield along the railroad tracks, which were fought over on the first day of the battle, and he spotted bone fragments that were uncovered from erosion. It had been a very rainy season. Human remains are scattered all over the battlefield, and it can never be known where they're all buried or if all of them were removed to the National Cemetery and other cemeteries. Archaeologists and forensic experts identified these remains that you see in this picture as a young man between 20 and 25 who was probably a Confederate soldier who was shot in the head on the first day and received other major wounds, probably from canister fire. His remains were removed and were buried in the National Cemetery as an unknown soldier. This summer, 2009, that summer, a tourist reported to the national park that bones were again spotted in the railroad cut. There are reports to the Park Service on the battlefield. Any reports are tested to see if they are human remains. and if they are a result of a civil war burial after the battle. Many bone discoveries, however, turn out to be those of animals, and the long bones of deer, of course, can often resemble human remains. Well, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, and we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work. And so I ask of you, honor the power of place, honor the power of this place, preserve our history. And thank you very, very much.